Wikipedia, you can find a place in the Wikipedia where it says there are three races. People come Mongoloid, Caucasoid, and Negroid. Those are the three racial groups. And it's a lie. It isn't just a myth, it's a lie. We need to get that out of Wikipedia. I don't mind what you put on Wikipedia as long as you're telling the truth or something that resembles the truth, but that's a lie. It ought to be taken out of the Wikipedia. That's somebody ought to excise that from that supposedly educational title.
How do you feel about reparations for Black Americans, and others, that especially in this country, that had to deal with the atrocities of, people who classify themselves as white?
Well, let me put it this way. I'm going to lose most of your Black audience now, but this is the way it is. The first modern human beings that came to this continent came from Africa. And the people who are suffering the most from COVID are Native Americans who came from Africa. Now, if you're going to give reparations, we better start giving reparations to the people whom we raped, killed, murdered in various ways, and whose land we took. Let's start there. I'm all for reparations from there. Want to give them back the land? I don't think you want to. I don't think you would stand for that for an instant. But and you need to realize that they were the first Americans. We called them Indians because Columbus and other people didn't know where the devil they were. So they thought they were West Indies. They must be Indians. They weren't Indians. They aren't Indians. They'll never be Indians. They were from Africa, as we all were. So if we're going to start with reparations, let's make reparations to the first people, the first Black people who came to this continent. Let's start with those people we call First Nations, because they were the First Nations. I doubt very much that there are unless you're in prison, and that's our new form of slavery in this country, is the prison industrial system. You know it as well as I do. But if you aren't in prison, you're probably not being enslaved, and you're probably not living on a dirt floor without any electricity, without any running water, without any central heating or cooling or air, and 100 miles from a hospital. But there are lots of Native Americans who are living in that very situation. And now somebody's going to say, we gave them the land. We gave them a postage stamp size of the land. We did not give them anything. We stole from them and gave very little back. If you're going to do reparations, let's do reparations for those folks first. I'm all for that. And I know now that that'll make a whole lot of people of color angry. But you have to, if you're gonna try to repair this situation, you better start where the worst damage has been done.
And what about the descendants of slavery?
I think the descendants of slavery deserve some kind of reparations, but I think the descendants of the First Nations deserve some kind of reparations too. And I think you can't do it for one without doing it for the other. And which one are you going to start with? Because you see, we tried to enslave Native Americans, but they would run away and get into the nearest village, and we couldn't tell which one, we couldn't tell them apart, so we couldn't tell which ones we had tried to enslave, and they got away. So we didn't start slavery with Black people, what we call Black people in this country. We started it with Native Americans. And we also brought indentured servants here from other countries to act as servants until they had worked long enough to pay back what it cost to bring them here and what they should have been paid while they were working. So that slavery didn't begin with people from Africa in this country. It began first with Native Americans, then with white folks, then with people of color, then with Africans.
We hear the word reparations being thrown around a lot, particularly in politics. And it looks like, I guess somebody got some information that Black people in America are looking for some reparations, because now we see that conversation. Well, would you offer it? Would you offer it? Would you offer it? Do you realistically see any type of reparation given to anybody in this country as we see it?
I think if you can prove that your people were one of those, was one of the families or a member of the family that was used unfairly, was enslaved, then that's one thing. But if you can't prove that, then that's another thing entirely. And I think practically every Native American in this country could prove it.
How would we
because their
prove?
names. Well,
How would
they've
the
got
census
the. You
Bureau
can go
prove?
through the. What?
I'm sorry to cut you off. How will Black Americans prove that if records and things were destroyed and we don't really have any actual proof of that? How would we prove that?
I don't know, and neither do you. But you can't prove it by just the fact that your skin is very dark, because there are a whole lot of people who came here not enslaved who came with very dark skin, and there have been a whole lot of people come to this country without coming here as slaves.
So my question would be, what's your motive? What was your motivation for teaching against racism when you first got started? Was it like a particular incident that got you, or was it just your life growing up that got you to start teaching out against racism?
What my father used to say to us when we were young, there were three daughters. My youngest daughter died at 3.5, but I had two sisters that were older than I was, Emma, and he would say to us, "Don't bring any pickaninnies into my house as grandchildren." And then my daughter married a man from Saudi Arabia. And before that, I did the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise with my kids in school, with my third graders. And this is what changed my father completely. I took the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, filmed in my classroom. The second year I did that exercise. The first year I did it, it was just the kids and me. And then the word got out, this awful thing that this horrible person had done with these little kids. And I did this exercise the following year, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation sent a film crew to film it. They took that film, they edited the film down to half an hour and threw it into a film about Eskimos in Canada, and sent me a copy of the film. And I showed it to my parents in their home. And my father was sitting there in his blue bib overalls and his blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow, and he was watching that film of those little white kids going through that exercise in racism, with the blue-eyed people being mistreated and the brown-eyed people being favored. He watched that for half an hour, and when it was over, he stood up, he took his red handkerchief out of the back pocket of his blue bib overalls, blew his nose, wiped his eyes, and said, "I wish somebody had taught me that when I was 9 years old." Now, I hadn't seen my father cry since I watched him cry after my little sister's death. But what he saw happening to those little kids, because of an exercise based on a physical characteristic over which they had no control, changed his idea about race and racism. At that moment, he said, "This has to stop." And he said to me later, when my mother was castigating me for doing such an awful thing to those children, he said, "Jane, you're sure you're right?" And I said, "Dad, I'm sure I'm right." He said, "Then by God, go ahead. Let the sons of bitches complain." And they complained.